Today I rise in support of my amendment, which cuts funding for the Bureau of Land Management by 50%. The mission of the BLM is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. Unfortunately, the BLM isn't living up to its stated purpose, and it's lost its way. It's becoming harder and harder for each new generation to use and enjoy our public lands because the BLM is locked in on its goal to lock out land users, including recreationists, livestock raisers, and energy producers. Earlier this year, the BLM proposed the so-called Landscape Health Rule, which seeks to replace productive activities under the BLM's multiple-use framework by creating an additional use, so-called conservation leases, a designation never approved by Congress. The current framework already balances conservation with other uses. Creating an entirely new use under the umbrella of conservation is simply a means to eliminate other uses and bar anyone from even setting foot on these lands. Now, I'm grateful that this act also includes a section that prevents funding from going towards the implementation of this proposed rule, but that is not enough. We must also address the BLM's overall agenda to lock us out of our federal lands. My amendment does just that, and I request my colleagues to support it. With that, I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the frustration that the gentlelady expresses in her statement, but I must rise in opposition to this amendment. The Bureau of Land Management's funding level is already $255.4 million, or 18% below the FY23 enacted level. A drastic 50% cut to already decreased levels leaves me concerned that this would put the agency in a position where they cannot carry out critical activities to address their most pressing issues in western states, particularly in Wyoming, Idaho, other states. The growing backlog for grazing and energy mineral activity permits, population problems with wild horses and burros that were just debated on the last amendment, and the increasing demand for increased recreational access to our public lands causes me deep concern when you want to cut the BLM by an additional 50%. So I must oppose this amendment, and I would yield to the gentlelady from Maine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And
the gentlelady from Maine is recognized.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the chair of this committee for opposing the amendment. As far as I'm concerned, this amendment is extreme. It will not gain bipartisan support and become law. The draconian cuts proposed in this bill violate the agreement reached by former Speaker McCarthy and President Biden that were memorialized in statute in Public Law 118-5, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, and we would not be teetering on the brink of government shutdown if my Republican colleagues would hold up their end of the bargain. But as to this amendment, with the West reeling from the historic megadrought, the worst in 1,200 years, why would any of my colleagues want to hamstring the Bureau of Land Management from protecting our public lands for the American public and future generations? I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman
reserve
yields.
the balance.
The gentleman reserves.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Wyoming.
The BLM has recently launched an attack on 3.6 million acres in Wyoming through its proposed draft Rock Springs Resource Management Plan, or RMP. Through their preferred alternative, they are trying to lock out land users by designating 1.8 million acres as areas of critical environmental concern, which essentially prevents us from accessing and using these lands, particularly as it relates to recreation, livestock grazing, and energy production and mineral extraction. The Rock Springs Draft RMP is entirely biased, unscientific, violates FLTMA and NEPA, and is an abuse of BLM's authority. We can mine, we can drill, we can graze, and we can recreate on federal lands while also conserving our important natural resources and wildlife. And in fact, we have been doing so for literally decades. Come to Wyoming and see how we have managed these resources. We have a beautiful state, abundant wildlife, clean water, and clean air. We are also one of the largest energy producers in the United States. Conservation and protection go hand in hand with grazing and energy development. The BLM's preferred alternative for the Rock Springs RMP does not strike the proper balance between conservation and development, would ravage Wyoming's and the nation's economy, and ultimately destroy opportunities to use the land in a productive, profitable, and effective way. The BLM has turned into an arm of the radical environmental organizations running this administration, is aggressively exceeding its authorization and ignoring its very purpose for existence. I encourage adoption of my amendment so that we can begin to right this ship. And with that, I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Not only is the BLM attacking the state of Wyoming's economy, but the economic well-being and security of every American. It continues to pursue these failed policies that force us to depend on importing our food and our energy, while also stifling competition for companies that operate on public lands. Examples of these aggressive actions including leading out on President Biden's war on oil and gas, as well as its war on coal. Crippling conservation efforts by eliminating uses that improve the environment, preventing local and state multi-generational input as to the most appropriate uses and management of land, also while pursuing policies that impact the value and quality of our property resources, and holding projects on federal lands hostage to environmental litigation, and then selling out to the demands of environmental groups that are gaining traction in the fight against local control. The BLM has perfected the sue and settle model, and all of us are suffering the consequences. And there are so many other examples of the BLM attacking the state of Wyoming as well as the economic well-being of every citizen in the United States. Mr. Chairman, today my state faces an onslaught of proposals from the Bureau of Land Management and other federal agencies as they pursue the terribly destructive Green New Deal. Cutting the BLM's budget as proposed in Amendment 2 is one step forward in addressing those attacks. And with that, I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Idaho reserves.
The system is no longer sustainable.
Gentlelady, do you wish to continue? Do you
Pardon
wish
me?
to continue?
Yes.
Okay, the gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you. The system that we have with the BLM is no longer sustainable, and most states across the West are struggling as a result. Because my colleagues in the House and Senate are wholly opposed to reining in the executive state, I have no choice but to try to slash the agency's budget to try to rein in what they have been doing. The fact is that the federal government's ever-growing presence in the West and its adversarial nature to our way of life is undermining our prosperity. In short, the BLM doesn't work for us anymore. It doesn't work for the people of Wyoming, and it doesn't protect our natural resources. It is time that we do something about it, recognize where the problem lies, and slash the budget. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has now been expired. She yields. Gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest that if the gentlelady has a problem with the Rock Springs area, that you address that specifically. But this cuts 50% of the BLM across the board.
Yes.
That means it's going to substantially impact Idaho. And guess what? We get along pretty well with the BLM in Idaho. If you cut this 50%, you're going to have tough times getting grazing permits. We've got minerals in what's called the phosphate patch in Idaho. BLM has to deal with. Our general problem is when the decisions that are made in Idaho, both by the BLM or the Forest Service or their other agencies, and those decisions come to Washington, then you got a problem. And that's where the problem exists. But this would cut 50% of actually the BLM across the country. So that's the problem I have with this, especially when we've already made an 18% reduction in their budget in this bill. So I understand where the gentlelady's coming from. Wyoming might have a special problem, and an amendment should be addressed to deal with that instead of the BLM in general. So I would oppose this amendment, and I hope my colleagues will vote no on it.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yield back the balance of my time.